So the title of this is the Essence of Interactive Art, because the CODAME month-long event is called the Essence of Art. So that's why I named it the Essence of Interactive Art. There's no singular essence of interactive art. Every interactive artist has their own take on it, so we're going to be seeing 3 different takes tonight. 20 years ago, there was an exhibit at Haines Gallery in San Francisco that had a dramatic effect on me personally, and it was a great event. So these 3 artists participated in that show 20 years ago, almost to the day, and so we can see what they've been doing in the meantime and what they have to say about their type of interactive art. So I'm delighted to have these people here. They definitely influenced my artistic journey going forward 20 years ago. So the first artist we're going to hear from is Brian Neff. He's in New York, so he'll be talking to us via Zoom. And then Camille Utterback and Scott Snibbe will follow that. So we'll have about 30 minutes apiece, and then we'll have time at the end for any panel discussion or Q&A. How people talk about things. So, Brian, you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. You're on.
Go ahead. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Thumbs up? All right. All right, well, I'm happy to be here. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I'm actually in Boston right now. Thank you, Tim, for setting this up. It's really kind of a trip. It has been 20 years, and a lot has changed since then. I remember that show quite well. I'm going to go to feedback. I remember that show quite well because my projector failed at the opening. It was devastating, and a good lesson in checking your equipment. So I'm just going to give a quick presentation of my work, mostly focusing on interactive pieces, but I'm going to slide into some non-interactive as well, just because I think they're interesting. This is a piece called Big Smile, which is just a way for me to say hello, and if we have time, I might show the video of it. So these are, as many of you know, these are flocking birds. They're European starlings, and what's really fascinating about them is you look at them and you sort of think that they're externally orchestrated. There might be some sort of controlling agent, but actually it's sort of this beautiful behavior is a result of lots and lots of individuals, all in very or quite simplistic behavior. And what emerges is this lovely flocking behavior. And what I love about this stuff is it never repeats. It's always unique, but yet there's a quality to it. You can always look at this and say, these are birds flocking, for example. And I think as you look at my work, this quality I try to put into my interactive pieces. And they're quite deep questions that come up with this stuff. Like, for example, we take billions of neurons and our cells, and we come up with consciousness, self-awareness from these individual interactions. Similarly, if you look at these sort of patterns in nature, patterns in space, you might think these are painted on by the mother or something, but actually what's happening is you have pigmentation molecules that are interacting with each other and stabilizing into these beautiful patterns. And again, there's this sort of uniqueness. No two zebras are alike, and yet you know what a zebra looks like. So there's sort of repetition and uniqueness. So it turns out, many of you might know this, but you can take some of these patterns and develop mathematical equations that will characterize them, and you can simulate them. And that's what I started to do with a series of pieces called the Healing Series. So just to be clear, what I'm doing here is I'm simulating mathematical equations millions of times a second to create these patterns. And the patterns end up looking very organic. The first couple of pieces I did about 20 years ago were called the Healing Series. And each one, when you walk across them, you basically create a wound, and they react differently. So in this one, the wound closes slowly, the two sides of the wound come together, but they never touch. So it leaves a scar that will remain there forever until somebody else comes across and walks across it and destroys it. This one melts your interaction, your wound, basically down to its essence, and then even that goes away, and it sort of goes back to this placid state. This one ended up being probably my favorite one of the few I did, because it's just very quiet, very quiet piece. Oop. And this one is quite aggressive. This is one of the only pieces where the blobs kind of self-generate. It's quite an angry piece, I see it as. And what's kind of fascinating about these pieces mathematically is that they are all the same equation with slight changes in the constants. And yet you get this quite different organic behavior. And I love the idea that these are they're very simple, they're deterministic, and yet they feel very organic. In all of those works, they were sort of low down to the floor. There was a very, very low barrier to entry. You could just walk across them. But I started to think about trying to force people to make more of a decision to interact with the pieces. So I made these flower pieces that are just a couple inches off of the ground. And some people did step onto them, as you see here, but something quite interesting happened where people would sort of gather around them, shoulder to shoulder, and just kind of wave their hands over them like a magic pool or something. It was quite an intimate thing that happened. And then I started to explore a little bit with this variation you can get from playing with these equations. So these are a series of pieces called Drift. There are 5 panels here. Each one is running the same sort of simulation with slight variations. And as the blobs move, they sort of permeate the boundary between one field and the next. They take on the characteristics of the next field. These pieces are quite slow and meditative, and when the blobs go off the left edge, they come back in on the right, so it's a closed loop. So it's a closed loop. These pieces are not interactive, but because of the way they're set up, they essentially won't repeat, at least not in my lifetime. So again, there's this sort of, there's a quality to it, there's a repetition, but there's a uniqueness to it, and it'll never be the same twice. And I started to think about how to make this piece interactive, or actually the way this is a critical way I think about interactivity. It's not really how to make this piece interactive, not how to engage viewers, but more like if this piece had an awareness of its surroundings, what would it do? What would that look like? So I started to do these very large drift wall pieces. So what I've done here is taken all those drift pieces, turned them 90 degrees, so the blobs are now moving upwards. There are a bunch of embedded cameras hitting the wall, and I gave the piece a very rudimentary idea of what a human face looks like. And the blobs are sort of bubbling up, and when it thinks it sees a human face, it's looking at a particular column. That column no longer drifts upwards, it slows down and starts drifting downwards for a little bit. So when you turn this piece on, every single column looks exactly the same. As soon as you look at a column, it will slow down. And just even for a split second, if it does that column will be forever different from all the rest of the columns. So essentially, when you look at this piece, like this image I have here, the way it looks is the result of everyone's looked at it since it was turned on. And what I also love is that the pieces are on at night too, so they continue forever, and often they kind of have a little bit of freak out when you turn the lights on or off as they adjust to new lighting. But there's sort of a sense of agency to them. With these larger pieces, I started to get interested in how they were fitting into architecture, and I made a series of drip pieces, very similar kind of methods, but fitting into column and cross beams and stuff, and starting to think about not projecting an image onto a wall or onto an architectural element, but thinking about projecting some kind of X-ray vision that was showing what was already there, somehow enhancing or displaying the blood or the soul or the heart of the building itself, what was in there. This is one that was done at Boston City Hall. This was actually an interesting piece, an interesting lesson in interactivity, because when I originally conceived of this piece, I was going to have cameras that would the blob basically would trigger when someone stepped on the elevator, and would slide down as they went down the elevator. But it was completely unnecessary. The piece just the blobs on the top moved downwards, and the blobs on the bottom moved upwards at the rate of the elevator, and you make that connection in your head. It was just much simpler and actually richer because it didn't always match people on the elevator. And it was just, it felt more like not a reaction, but a communication, I guess. Many years later, I came back to this, simulating these in 3 dimensions. So basically, I was doing some work about embryos. My wife and I were doing some IVF stuff, and these are simulations that are constrained to a cube. So very similar to the 2-dimensional healing pieces and stuff, I'm simulating these organic emergent patterns, but they're in 3 dimensions. And I'm varying sort of the chemicals or the constants in the simulation, and I'm randomizing the start points of the 2-cell embryo, and whatever happens, happens. And I ended up simulating thousands of them, 40,000 I think. Many of them exploded, some of them just shrank down to a dot, some became solid. And I printed, at the time, 3D ceramic printing was pretty new, and a friend of mine was doing it, and was able to print these for me in unglazed ceramic. And they're quite lovely to touch. They have a sort of very soft feel to them. It's very organic feel. And this piece here, a lot of them split. So this is a 2-cell embryo that split. These 2 halves actually fit together kind of perfectly. I'm split to some different kind of work now. So as a result of this work, a lot of this way of looking at complex behavior, complex patterns, is a way that scientists try to understand complexity in the world. And so this work, very luckily, got the attention of some researchers at Harvard Medical School. We started talking and became friends, and ended up getting a residency at Harvard Medical School. And they were very nice to me. Ended up staying there for several years working with the researchers. But one of the first things that I was asked to do was just do a commission at Harvard. And I became enamored with this building. This is called Memorial Hall. A lot of people think it's a church, but it was actually built right after the Civil War to honor the folks who went to Harvard who fought and died for the Union side of the Civil War. And at the time it was made, and for decades afterwards, and still to this day, it's quite controversial and quite a point of contention about whether they should honor the graduates of Harvard who fought for the South. At the time I was asked to do a piece, I originally was going to do something kind of abstract about mythology, but this story just grabbed me. And it was at the time that Bush and Gore, the Bush and Gore election happened, and a lot of people felt that Bush stole the election, and I was just hearing a lot of anger from my friends and people around me, and even quite violent feelings. And if you look at the red-blue states, and we talk about that now, and you overlap that with the North and South states, it's really apparent. Civil War is still sort of very much affecting us. So anyway, this piece is about that. These marble tiles have the names of the folks who fought from the North. The beautiful hall. And I basically projected these luminous images onto the marble tiles with hints of text on them. And as you walk across, you wound it opens up and you see information about the Confederate Day. But one of the key things is that instead of saying their names, I had a relationship there. The idea being, if you can't find some kind of empathy for someone who was, perhaps morally wrong, or was on the other side of a conflict, maybe you can at least have considered the suffering of people who love them when they die. And the floor eventually heals itself and covers itself up. So I'm going to show a bunch of non-interactive work just real quick. While I was at the medical school, I ended up working with a lot of model organisms, which are organisms that are studied kind of sort of like fruit flies. You've probably heard of rats. Like a lot of labs around the world study the same organisms, so basically you can compare notes and techniques and stuff. This is Xanthus tropicalis, which is used because their eggs are quite large and transparent, and so you can sort of like research development. And I got a little lab space, and I got some of these, and I started photographing them, photographing through their metamorphosis, spent a lot of time with them, developing some techniques to kind of create some videos, and created a bunch of works based on this kind of idea of the frog kicking into adulthood and then shrinking back into youth and forever cycling. This particular piece is called Frog Time, and like a lot of the other works, it won't really repeat. The frog has an energy level that fluctuates. The higher his energy level, the more he swims, the faster he swims, against this kind of monotony of time behind him. And there's a spotlight that tries to keep him in the center. And so again, it will kind of have the same quality, but essentially it won't repeat. I like making these kind of dynamic, like non-repeating videos. And I made a bunch of pieces. A lot of the times when I make work, what tends to, you probably see this, what tends to happen is I do a lot of research, a lot of processing, and then I make a bunch of work using the results of that. So this is another piece about rapture. And all of these frog pieces, it was kind of important to me to make the frogs quite big. This is what I call chunky frog time. So you had to sort of confront the frog at their level. They were sort of equal to you. And that became very important. The next set of work I did was with these are microscopic nematodes called Caenorhabditis elegans. They're probably the most studied multicellular organism in the world. Here they are growing on fungus and bacteria and archaea that are cultivated from my hands. And I really started to think about like, how can I have any kind of meaningful connection with these creatures that are so small and in this environment where essentially I'm like a god to them, where I'm feeding them, if they die, it's my fault, I'm killing them, I'm moving them around. So one of the things I started to do is to make microscopic sculptures. So this here is a worm that I took, I made a tiny sculpture of it, and I put it into the worm's environment as an avatar of myself. I'm glad you're laughing. The work is like, it's quite serious, but it's also very tongue-in-cheek. And just to give you a sense, that worm there is maybe the size of a period, a small period in the setting. That's how small these are. So all this work was done through a microscope. I made a whole bunch of different sculptures. I made a bunch of labyrinths and meditation paths, and I was curious if they were interested in meditation. The bottom one was kind of funny. There was only one worm that came to the center, and he was very calm. The rest of them were quite aggressive. And I was kind of playing with doing experiments, but I wasn't as interested in the results of the experiments as in the process and the procedure of coming up with them and taking these photographs and going through the whole sort of rigmarole of making these sculptures and seeing what happened. Some of you hopefully recognize this. This is the man and woman disarming Carl Sagan and his wife. So we etched them onto the Pioneer spacecraft and sent it out beyond the solar system. And in many ways, no aliens will ever find this, and I feel it's more about sort of like us saying hello to the heavens, like going to the top of a mountain and shouting your names. And here I'm shrinking them down to worm size and saying hello to the worms. And if you're curious, this is how these were made. It's photolithography, like those little bits and pieces there, those are the actual maize and stuff. It was very important to me that the worms, I didn't force the worms into these structures. So if you look at what's going on here, there's a big circle to the left and right of every structure. I would put the worm into there so they could sort of choose to go into the structure or not. There was some sort of trying to get away from controlling them, even though I was controlling them. And I like to show this picture because this is can be a modern artist's lab. And this is how I work. This is the microscope, those are my worms, and that little pack on the left. And just things change. Like I have a normal studio here as well, but this is where I worked for probably 6 months. Now back to the interactive work. During that time and continuing for a while, I was making these pieces that I call exempla. And they are all these little kind of moral tales almost, where these creatures, they're all based on a 3-year-old's drawings. I actually took these out of a friend of mine's garbage. His kid had drawn them, and I love them. These little characters, you probably recognize these things. It's like a particular developmental stage, I think, where they look just so determined and kind of angry. And so I made a bunch of pieces, and they're all, each one, they're striving to better themselves somehow. So in this case, they're very simply, each one is trying to get on top of all the others. And these are, the way they're programmed, if you're curious, the program is like that flocking behavior. Each one has a very simple behavior, but you get this sort of like, they build a pile there. And then like capricious gods, we can come in and we just destroy their environment and they have to react to that. All of the controls are very big, chunky arcade controls that I got from an arcade company. And this one, they're stuck in, well, in this one, they, you turn on the light and they swarm towards it one at a time. They get inside and they inflate and they're ejected in agony or ecstasy, you don't know. Paralyzed, they fall down, they shrink, and then they do it again. Over and over again. So like, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Flatland, but in some ways, from their perspective, they're just better than themselves. From our perspective, we just see they're cycling and cycling and cycling. And when I show these, I love to show them in these sort of groups, like, you know, sort of like buildings, like, you know, the analogs might be like the gym and the meditation center and the university and our house, and like this sort of sense that I call them bubs. The bubs can move from one to the other. They're all independent pieces, but the sense is that here's another version, so you can see 4 of them, and the big, you see the big buttons and stuff. Switching again vein, this is a piece that is more like the Memorial Hall piece. I was commissioned to do a piece for the Speed Art Museum. They're having a renovation. And this is a manor house in England that had a beautiful parlor room covered in these gorgeous wood carvings. And it was, I think it was created in like the 1600s and it was bought by Hearst in the 1920s and eventually made its way to the Speed Museum in Louisville, Kentucky. This is them installing it. And I was commissioned to do an intervention in the room to kind of bring it into the 21st century. And the museum at the time, you know, the way the museums these days handle period rooms has really evolved, and they're very conscious of it being a period room and not putting in like fake furniture, and not putting a fake sunset in the window. And in fact, you can't see it in this image, but they made sure to show the scaffolding behind the room. You know, that you're trying to say like this is fake, and we know it's fake. I started to think, well, basically looked a lot at the history of the room, and a lot of these carvings are based on Ovid's Metamorphoses. Ovid was the Roman who was championing the kind of magic in Greek myths. And these carvings are based on etches done, illustrations done for his book, done by European artists in Italian Renaissance style. And English wood carvers in the 1600s took that, made these, put them onto this incredible parlor room as a symbol of wealth. It was bought by Hearst, and eventually made its way to the Speed Museum and then to the renovation. And so it had this really deep history, and I wanted to find a way to put people into that history. This is Actaeon and Diana, if you know that myth. So this is the eventual piece. Basically, it has an awareness of it's in the room, it's recording you, and it plays you back in the window looking into the room, into the fireplace also looking into the room. Yeah. And the faces are altered a little bit. They're made kind of very more graphic. It was very important to me. It's not, you know, it's not like you go in the room and you see yourself. There's a chance you might see yourself, probably more of a chance to see yourself than other people, but you'll see other folks. You'll see folks who were there earlier in the day, earlier in the month, earlier in the year, in fact. So it's sort of like the piece has a memory that fades over time and juxtaposes the various people who've been in the room. What's fun about this piece is that the way I'm detecting he was a human or not, a lot of this was done before a lot of the amazing deep learning stuff that's out today. And so occasionally in the mornings you'll see a moth there instead of a human, because the janitor comes in and cleans the room and it thinks he's a person. So and for me, for these kinds of pieces, that's totally fine. Like it's not a perfect piece. It has a rudimentary idea of what humans look like, and it tries to capture them. It's often wrong, and that's fine. So, since the pandemic, I've kind of stepped a little bit back from the art world, but I've been making these smaller, much more intimate pieces with a sculptor named Natalie Andrews. These are her sculptures, and she writes on them, kind of like a journal or diary. And we've been working together on a bunch of pieces that are much more intimate, much smaller. All the kind of tech is hidden. And here we have these three figures that are going through these sort of very subtle idle motions. They're kind of connected, they sort of affect each other a little bit. There's a day and night cycle, but they randomize a lot. So again, there's repetition, but uniqueness. It's a very subtle piece. It's the kind of thing where you could walk in a gallery and look at it briefly and not notice it. And I love that. I love that. It kind of rewards the deeper look. And I also love that when the piece is turned off, there are still these beautiful sculptures there. And I'm not getting a sense of scale. I would say that middle piece is maybe 4.5 inches high. And like I said, all the tech is hidden in the plane. And these are some prototypes of pieces that we've been working on. This is one where there's a man falling forever, and when you touch the piece, he basically stops for a bit and rests. So using some capacitive sensors in there. This is a three-ring circus, so there's some bringing some absurdity into the work. So this is a sort of a triangular piece that's on a turntable, and when you turn it, you see these different sort of quirky characters. Here's some very, very early work. These are some molds we've made, and this is sort of playing on the myth of Sisyphus, being sort of squeezed inside, and just some more sketches we've been doing. And again, these will be collective, so each one is unique, repeating in a way, but not exactly repeating, perhaps connecting with you in a very intimate way, like touching the pieces or turning them. And that's it, I think. Do we have time, a couple more minutes, or how many minutes time?
You're doing good.
All right, let me just show a big smile. So in some ways, a lot of my pieces sort of distill to this. So it's a piece that only smiles when no one's looking at it. There's very, very much this idea that the pieces have their own agency. They're not there for you. They exist even if you're not in the room. But when you come in and you have that connection with them, you're both changed, hopefully. And I would say in some ways that's something I strive for in a lot of my work. So anyway, that's what I got. Thank you all. I'm looking forward to the
Late in New York, so we should probably get a few questions in for Brian. Go ahead.
Hi, it looks like you're using video cameras for all of the input into this. Is that true? Well, except for that you talked about the capacitive detectors, but it sounds like you're analyzing video for all of the input.
Yeah, but most of my stuff, that's kind of what I'm trained in. Computer vision stuff. So most of it does come down to that. But nowadays I'm doing some other sensor-based stuff.
And I mean, a long time ago I imagine you weren't using AI, but you are now?
Yeah, so a lot of us using OpenCV. There was a very rudimentary phase detector using cascades that worked pretty well that I use on this FaceTime piece. Written by some guys at Mitsubishi Electronics, and using OpenCV for a lot of stuff, and coming up with some algorithms myself. But yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question about.
I can't see anyone. Somebody else has to.
Okay. I didn't quite catch how did you project the little figures onto the sculptures? Are those projected from the inside or the outside, or what is that?
So these are from the inside. We have some that are from, these are from the outside. We have some that are from the inside using super thin porcelain clay that we're using and using e-ink displays and stuff. But these, basically there's a mini projector, kind of small projector I could get that was at least about 500 lumens. It's hidden in the plinth, and there's a very, very small mirror, maybe like 2 inches by 1 inch, that's sticking out of the plinth, and so the projector hits the mirror and then hits these guys. So all you see is these 3 guys in the plinth, and then a very small little slot coming out.
One more? Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Brian. The videos came out, I mean, they were quite smooth, so
Okay.
the bandwidth worked out.
Oh, very good. And I'll definitely stick around, so if there are more questions later, I'm happy to answer.
Cool. Okay, I'm going to switch the video and sound.
Come on, Tim.
Camille's.
Hey, Brian. Thank you, Tim, again. This has been so fantastic to have this kind of reunion tour of the RX Gallery show. It happens to also be my husband Brett and I were realizing the first time we ever met was at the dinner after that show that we were both with other people and didn't start dating for many years after that. But it's interesting to have those moments you can look back and what, you know, how does the world work out? Could have happened in many different ways, but it's lovely to be thinking about that again too. So I'm going to just give a sort of broad view of my practice, and I came up with questions that I personally think lead to good interactive art, right? Since the title was the essence of interactive art, I do think, as Tim said, it's really personal. We're all such different artists, even though we've known each other for such a long time. So my first question, is that okay?
Okay.
I think I happened upon this sort of by accident in this very early piece I did with Romy Achituv. So this was our sort of thesis work or finishing work we were doing as grad students at the Interactive Telecommunications program at NYU. There's a camera hidden behind the screen, and the letters that are falling are a poem that people can catch. Some of you may have seen that. This was here when 01 had their space on South First Street. So this was the patent pending show, which you were also in, Scott, I think, right? Yeah. Brian, Scott, and I have been in a variety of configurations of shows over time, so it's fun to call those out too. So I'm gonna let this play and just talk over it. But for me, in terms of this, again, this was 1999, I should say, when we first did this piece. So people were surprised to even see themselves on a projection, in a projection screen. But the rules of this interaction are really quite simple. The letters are landing on the edges of anything they see that's darker than the background. So it's super duper simple computer vision, if you can even call it that. But in some ways, because the system is so simple, it has this quality of being very open-ended, right? So I think now there's all these much more sophisticated ways of tracking people. We can find their fingers, we know when their face is there. Brian was using that in an interesting way. But sometimes I think that having these kind of more simple systems allow this kind of thing, right? Where the kid thinks, hey, I can catch the letters on the top of the umbrella, what about underneath, right? So from a design point of view, I like interactive systems that are legible. Like, it was really important to me, again, in retrospect, kind of thinking about why was this piece so successful, is that you see yourself, which is like a mirror. We know how to use a mirror. And so that part is very legible. We understand how letters work in the world. They land on us. You don't have to read any instructions or work too hard to understand what's happening, but you can, the piece can keep expanding. Like, you can start to read what's in the text, maybe. People always found things in the text that wasn't there in the poem that's in the piece, right? Because they were catching different letters from different words and coming to tell me what they were reading. People told me lots of things this piece told them. But especially the interaction between people and their sense of exploring the system were really open-ended. So I think that's something I see. I'm a professor now. I see a lot of students making interactive work. We have interactive devices in so many places in our lives, like Snapchat. Think these video kind of filters. I often think they've become less interesting the more sophisticated they've become, because the interaction is so much more constrained. So that's one question. And another part of this too, it's these tools that have evolved, right, like to do skeleton tracking or machine learning, give us a really rich set of tools. But I also wonder sometimes, like, when does that sophistication also become at odds with the best art? So Brian talked about capturing the moth by mistake, right? Like, where is the noise or just the richness and messiness of the world, like, eliminated from these systems? And I think about that especially in terms of, I don't know if this is as much the case anymore, but like the definition of a skeleton, if it's a person with 2 arms and 2 legs, that's a very specific person, right? Not everybody has that configuration in their body. And so in some ways, again, using this kind of tracking where I was just looking for edges and the kind of blobbiness of people, it allows a kind of, it allows it to really express like the lumpiness and strangeness of all of us, right? Like people, these letters catch on people's hair, you know, different, like if you have big ponytails or an afro or whatever, right? So it's like, I really like to think about that again in this kind of spectrum of like when the interaction becomes more and more defined, what is lost, right? But where can we capture some of that interest and kind of noise, if you will, in the world, and have that be part of the piece. So this is the third question. So second was when does the relying on these pre-made tools or algorithms create false limitations? That was the way I phrased that question to myself here. This question is, how can you compose or create different layers or types of interaction all in the same work? So the piece on the left is Untitled 5 from 2004, which was the piece that was in the RX show. This was actually a show at the Milwaukee Art Museum that Scott, Brian, and I were all in, also curated by George Feifel, who we miss, one of the curators who was really supportive of this kind of work early on. And Untitled 6 is on the other side. So these were a series of pieces I did for, I think, about 7 years. In some ways I'm still doing them, where I was trying to think about drawing systems and how could you create a drawing system that was open and reacting to movement in a space, but that evolved in enough different ways over time that it had the richness of a painting. Like you would want to come back and look at this over and over again. You didn't just like get it. Like it wasn't a sort of one-liner of interaction. So these are 3 pieces. This was the first time I ever had a chance to show a bunch of these pieces together, and that was super instructive to see like how the sort of pace and speed of the different pieces actually changed how people interacted with them. So I'm going to break down some of the rules in Untitled 5 for you, which is something I like to do, to talk about kind of how did I get, what I was really happy about in this piece was a kind of layering of it, different types of mark making and different types of interaction. So I think this is a video. Let's see. Go. So this very shortly turns into a time lapse where you can see it kind of evolving. The big aha moment for me in sort of composing the rules of the system was when I figured out how to connect something that happened in the past with something that was in the present. So this is a trajectory. That was the camera looking down at someone I forgot to mention. And then when that person leaves, their trajectory gets populated with these little marks. And a person walking through the space later can push those marks out of the way. And then the rule is the marks have to go back to where they were. Right, so I got really excited that this was kind of a way to make connections across and through time using the code. And I'll show you how this piece evolved in a second, but I literally thought of it kind of like a musical composition. I'm not at all musical, but how could these different parts work together? So this was a behavior of like a little spray of dots that started when someone stood still. So I was thinking, a lot of our interaction is about how do we react to movement or things happening, but what about if I reacted to when things weren't happening, if you will, and like how could those work together to create sort of positive and negative space or different kind of marks in the same way a painter might think about those things. Oops. So here's this piece evolving like in my studio. This is me running around in my studio with the camera overhead. I just started with lines, trying to move them as I walked through. I ran around more and the lines, I changed the parameters, they pushed further out. Started adding texture, scanning different things for the lines. There's a little bit of teacher moment too, right? Like how much effort do you have to put into a piece to make it good too, right? Like I think sometimes software has this sense of like ease or something. And I like to show this as how you can like noodle on an idea for a long time. So I figured out how to make a background. Some of these I can't remember. Here's the trajectory following someone around. I felt like that other stuff, there was like no kind of clear line that was happening, so I tried to build that. These are both things happening together. This was the aha moment, because the line that came with, oh sorry, I hope you can hear me when I don't have my, can you hear me? No, I had walked across left to right, and then I realized, okay, this is my first test of this. What if then I could push that line out of the way? So then the second swipe was me walking up and down, this way in this space, and realizing I could connect those things. And then I started adding like other scanned marks to go along those lines. These are the ants. I think of them as ants. I don't know, other experiments playing with. This for me also was a combining of scanning in pre-made marks and then manipulating those too. So I was really trying to get a kind of different texture than I think I still see in a lot of algorithmic work that's very sort of mathematical looking, which I love also, but I have a way background as a painter, and so I was trying to get some of that quality in here as well. So these are basically the final, close to what the final piece was creating. And people always ask, when does a tool, or I ask also, but it's a question of interest, like when does a tool become fluid? Like when do you stop kind of seeing the tool and it really feels like an expression of yourself? And I think there's part of this of like, can there be such a thing as an artist's hand, like a recognizable quality of a rule-based work by an artist? And so this is a drawing I had made, kind of the last drawing I made before I started making things with computers. And so I think that this piece answers that question for me, that I somehow had reached a level where I could create something visually out of code and typing and writing and people moving in the space that had some similar qualities that I could create drawing. And I won't talk about this too much, but again, I love doing this. So this is a piece that was like 2019 in the Smithsonian Museum called Precarious. So I was still thinking about how to use an overhead camera to move lots of different marks in different ways. So you can look at that on my website if you want. All right, the next rule, let's see. How can digital tools connect us to shared places and histories? So I think a big problem with a lot of our interfaces is they're totally about us. They're like really solipsistic. It's all about you, it's reacting to you. It's not, we call things social media, but we're not really doing that in relation to each other in a shared place. We're all in different places. So I'm going to show a couple of examples of work where I tried to think about using that interactivity to have people negotiate their space maybe not as much as Scott's boundary functions, but how could people looking at each other through the piece sort of change what they're thinking about? So this is a piece that's very similar to those drawing systems I showed before. It's called Entangled. But there's two interactive spaces, one on each side of this scrim, and the projectors are projected like overlapping each other, and because it's a scrim, you see both pieces overlapped, so whatever was happening on one side of the piece was completely visible on the other. So you didn't really have like your own space, you had to negotiate it with someone else. It was also an interesting material experiment of making this. I was trying to make the projection kind of dimensional. There's 3 scrims, so it actually had like depth in it as well, which is something else I'll talk about in a second. And I explored this in some other ways in proposals that I didn't get to do. This was a project that I was hoping to use LCD glass, which is actually like our laptop screens are transparent. They just have a white backlight behind it. They're opaque when they're black. So I wanted to use them in this way where there would be sensors on either side of these plinths, and then the animations would change when people were looking at each other, but not when they weren't. So I won't get into all the details of that, but it did some prototypes of like actually, I don't know if this is a video, oops. You could see through it. And then the other interesting thing about that is when the sunlight shines through it, it creates shadows or lack of shadow on the ground. So I was interested in how could this piece, instead of screens that are always taking us away from our shared space, like we've got our heads down on our phones, like could I create a dynamic digital piece that engaged with the physical space somehow. So I liked how this was almost like a sundial, and the shadows from the animations would be seen on the ground, as well as you seeing the world through them and each other through them. Rafael Lozano-Hammer actually just posted a very similar kind of idea that he's been working on using OLED screens, I think, that I'm really excited about. This is the last question. How do we honor more of our perceptual abilities as humans with these systems? So I love that Brian was starting to do things in so many different media as well. I have gone on a sort of trajectory of thinking about glass and layering of glass as a way to create screens that aren't just flat, or they may be still flat, but they have multiple layers, right? So we're looking at all these digitally generated things like on our watches, on our phones, on our screens, and they're completely, those surfaces don't really accept wear very well. Like if you think of other things like jewelry or clothes, like that become over time like showing a sense of having been lived in or loved or passed down from someone to you, our digital devices can't really do that. They break basically. It's hard for them to have these kind of qualities that I think we like in the world, So I was trying to figure out different ways to do that, and also just honor like our ability to see different kinds of textures. So this is a piece that I did in 2013 that was in Boston, at Liberty Mutual Insurance Company. It was a commission, but the projections are onto multiple layers of glass. And so you can really see those different layers in the piece. And this was also a way to think about how could I create work that worked in different lighting scenarios, right? So anytime you're using projection, it's really hard because you're fighting the light. So this glass, has different characteristics when there's more sun in the space and you see the colors in the glass versus the projections over it that happen when it's darker. There's cameras, sorry, I forgot to say. It's similar to these other pieces. You can sort of see the cameras up in the ceiling there. And in this detail, I really like, it might be sort of hard to see, but there's sandblasting in the glass too, so you get shadows from the projection, as well as colored light from the projection, as well as colored light from the glass when the white light is going through the colored glass. So it becomes this very complicated perceptual phenomenon of like, what are you actually looking at? I mean, it's all light, right, reflecting in different ways, but where the light is coming from is actually quite complicated. I think Brian was actually at the opening for this, and there were people that I knew did a lot of work, with screens, were asking like, what is this? And it's like, well, it's just a couple layers of glass with projection on it. And people ask that about the scrim piece too, like at Stanford, these people are like, what is it? I'm like, it's light on scrim. But no, like, what is it? What kind of display is it? It's like, no, it's just a couple pieces of fabric with light hitting these different layers of fabric. But we become so used to this one idea of what a screen is, that I'm interested in pushing back on that a little bit. We have such, we just have so much more possibility in how we can see things in the world. So these are some other little experiments in this vein of projecting, sort of projection mapping into custom glass. I made with some folks at Pilchuck Glass School. I got to do a residency there. So these are just little mini projectors aimed at glass that has an opaque chips in it. So and I've mapped out all the rest of the light so you don't get tons of light on the wall behind it. Oops. And then here's some other thick layers of glass. I was trying to make it a residency at Bullseye over in the East Bay. Show a really quick video of this. This is sort of an experiment, right? But so there's an iPad behind this thick, it's about a 1/2 inch thick glass, but when you shift the colors in the glass, it really changes your perception. Sorry, when you shift the colors in the iPad screen, it changes the color of light coming through those other layers of glass to you, and you see all the texture of the bubbles and stuff. I'm still working on like how to create this into a bigger scale piece, because the glass gets really big and heavy when you make it much bigger than this. But I'm trying. So here's some of the bigger pieces of glass I made there. Let's see. Oh, and so then for so I think this is like thinking about the way, going back to Untitled 5, connecting moments of time of people in the space. I think there's also a way where different kind of materials can connect us to a deeper time. And one thing that I find really upsetting again about this kind of, especially being here in Silicon Valley, is this kind of fantasy that we only live in the present or maybe the future, like there is really no meaningful past that we're going to acknowledge or think about and work. And everything is here for us, right? Us as an individual, we're not interconnected. So that's something I'm still trying to think about bringing into the work even more in terms of interaction too, right? Like how do we engage with people around us? So the last piece I'm gonna just give you a brief glimpse of is a piece, it doesn't actually have a title yet, but I've been commissioned to do for Stanford University for their data sciences and computational complex building. So the piece is in this stairwell. The stairwell is not my idea, that's the architect's idea. There are 5 glass panels. Again, I'm working with Mara, who I did the Flourish piece with. And there's projections onto each of these, and they will react to how people are moving through the stairs. And my goal is really to think about other more historic forms of encoding information, and like how that is, again, nothing that we're encoding in our computers, it really doesn't have a material aspect to it, right? The computers end up as e-waste. The specifics of those materials matter to what can be encoded and how. So I won't go totally into it, but there's things like obvious things like jacquard looms and those jacquard cards and silk patterns have gotten really into different sort of textile histories, different kind of historic maps. So these are some of the prototypes of the triangles in my studio right now. These are just acetate versions that I'm working on the projections, or figuring out how to develop the projections for this piece. But again, you can be on either side of these screens in this case, right? So they have the quality in the daytime of almost acting like stained glass, and then when the projections can be visible, you can see that from both sides. Here's one of the silk patterns, my assistant Carmen helping me out. And these are some of the prototypes of the glass that I just finished this summer for each of the different triangles. I think I have one last video. Okay, so here's, again, just test videos, but thinking about like how you have a relationship between some kind of projected imagery and these substrates of the glass. And the idea is that there's a relationship between the sort of pattern that is embedded in the material of the glass and then the animation, which is this kind of overlay on top of it. I think that's it. Thank you.
We got time for sure. So I love the aha moments that you described, that of your own. You discovered them from your own point of view. Have you had, observing the audience of your works, what kind of aha moments have you had when you're observing?
Oh yeah, that's a great question, Tim. I think one of my favorite ones, I didn't talk about it that much, but in the show that had a bunch of pieces of the external measure series, so the drawing systems pieces, I sort of said seeing all of those together really taught me a lot about how people will react differently to different tempos in the pieces. So each of those has a very different speed of how things are moving, and also cadence. So like one of the pieces was always drawing, and like Brian talked about this too, like pieces that feel aggressive almost, like it's constantly drawing, and so you would walk into the camera view, it would react to you, things would change, but as soon as you left, it would like absorb your mark, like you would vanish, your trace would vanish because the piece was always drawing. And I felt that people in that piece got a little bit more like agitated, right? Like they would jump back into the light, which is the area where you're being tracked more frequently, versus the pieces like the one I showed a tiny bit of Untitled 5 that had this sort of slowness to the movement and would stop. If you were stepping into that piece, it was like you were moving it from a kind of stillness to change. And so it was almost like people would negotiate, like, if you had just walked through it, if I walked through, it's gonna change what was there. And so I kind of would make eye contact with you, like, is it okay? I'm not gonna do this, right? Or, so that was very instructive to me in terms of how sophisticated we are in terms of matching ourselves to kind of a tone of an interaction. I have friends who've worked at places like the Museum of Natural History in New York and have also talked about like the violence that people do to an interface if it doesn't work the way they think. You know, Donald Norman talks about this, like you see doors where the handles are broken because it looks like you should push and you pull, and like, you know, like that repeated thing, the door handle's always falling off because it's badly designed. But I think with a lot of interface interaction design too, you kind of can see. So my friend was telling me that kids would just like mangle things in the museum because it wasn't obvious to them what they were supposed to be doing, right? It wasn't malicious, it was just like they couldn't figure it out. In that same piece, let's see if I can go back to it. This is I'll be quick here, but let's do this. Whoops. Oh, sorry, I don't know why it's not showing. Let's see. I was trying to show you, there we go. These lit rectangles on the ground are how I demarcate where the camera's looking in these pieces, and I tried this in various different ways. In fact, at RX, we were getting some kind of like PVC material, like sign material. We didn't have any way, I hadn't figured out that there were these nice theater lights you could do something like this with, so I was like literally putting something on the floor. And if that becomes thick at all, people like stamp on it and jump on it, because it seems like that's the sensor, right? Like there's a thing on the floor and you're walking on it. So once I figured out I could make it out of light, no one did that anymore, right? I don't know if people would even tell you that that's what they were doing or why, but like from observing people, they're very sensitive again to like what the interface design is. So with this, I like that it's like light, and it's obvious there's nothing on the ground, so you're not going to stamp. You wonder where the sensor is. Yeah, sorry, long answer to a question.
That's great. Christopher, go.
Yeah, I noticed in some of the pieces that you described last, you are having fixed images painted on sheets of glass, and then the projections coming on, and I totally get why that's, I totally get the upside of that, which is that in the daytime it looks like something.
Yeah.
Which is something that a problem I have with my own work. People say, well,
make
it look like something when it's light. But do you ever think, crap, when it's actually going at night, do you wish that imagery wasn't there so you'd have more flexibility on what images you could display?
Yeah, it's even more complicated than that. I'm still struggling with that. I didn't go into that piece as much because I knew I didn't have tons and tons of time, but there's a color layer in the glass where the colored patterns are, and then there's a white layer. let me see this. So they're actually sided too. So like one side has more color on it than the other side. And so the projections coming through, the projection is like blending with the color in the imagery as well from the outside, but not from the inside. So even at the same time, it looks different on both sides. I think that's a real creative challenge though. I think I'm gonna figure it out. The thing that you also get is which doesn't come through in photos at all, this work on glass, it's hard to photograph. We see that the light is not bouncing right off the surface of that the way it would off a wall. It feels like it's glowing from inside because of the glazing I've used. So it's almost like these images are coming from inside the glass is what it looks like. So I think there's a way to use that. And then if you have a dark area, it looks like you can still see through it. So these pieces, I don't know how to photograph this yet, but they become much more like scrims. So I think there's a way to play with that kind of delicacy and the light and the way we see through it and don't see through it, and that changes, that will make up for the difficulty of trying to register or think about those two images. So,
Right.
But you all can come see this. I didn't mention this piece should be open probably end of March on campus, and you'll be able to see it from outside on campus. It's on James Stanford Way, which is the crossing of, I don't know how much people go down.
You mean
there,
the staircase?
yeah, the staircase will be visible from outside at night if you're roaming around campus. So hopefully you can come and let me know what you think about that decision.
How long will it be there?
It's permanent. Permanent. Well, again, so part of also using the glass is if someone chooses not to maintain this, there's still a piece of the glass. And this is like I started this with the Liberty Mutual piece, the Flourish piece in the hallway. I give when you write a contract of like what can people do with this work, I give permission that it can live in the glass form if the tech isn't updated, because I at this point have so many pieces that are defunct where the city doesn't have the money or there isn't someone who can maintain it. They become transient, which is fine sometimes, but I'm getting old enough, I don't want everything to be completely transient. It's nice to have some things that can live. So I'm trying to design the glass to be interesting enough also that it can stand on its own. And then there's this layer of dynamic animation, but I think it's kind of unrealistic to think that you can update all that camera technology and all the projection technology for much more than 10 or 15 years. So that's a short, again, this history question of like, how do these things have multiple layers of life? So, thanks.
We got time for one more while I change the video.
Cool.
Yeah, I just have kind of short but also one question. I'm super intrigued when you're talking about self-knowledge is like a bubble or thinking everything is about the future, and the artworks that you say that encapsulates the past and the present. So I'm curious, in your work, do you find that certain material have the ability to hold or reflect certain period of time, of space, and how does that influence your creative process?
That's a really great question. I mean, the thing I didn't talk about, I started to do some more traditional printmaking as well, where I'm using like a pen plotter to draw and then make a plate, and then actually pull a print, like an etching or different kinds of techniques there, because the quality of paper, I think, has this, it has a sense. We see that the ink is like pushed into the paper, right? So you understand just by looking at it, even if you don't really know anything about printmaking, you feel how that ink is embedded in the paper, and we understand about trees and fibers, and we have so much knowledge of stuff, even if we aren't articulating it. So like in that, the paper feels sort of cozy or something, because fibers are closer to like things we wear, whereas the glass, I think sometimes like the ones with the little chips inside that I said had the mini projectors, it's like amber or something. The projection's like caught inside the glass. I mean, these are my associations, but I think people bring so much from our material knowledge of the world to pieces that are made out of a particular material. So I don't know if that's answering the question. I'm still exploring it, I guess, is what I'm saying. But I think that like these things are industrially produced, right? Like but intentionally they're meant to be exactly the same. Everything is meant to be exactly the same. They're not supposed to look like they came from anywhere, right? In a sense, this is my focus on this. So, you know, maybe there's a way to work with that too, but I think that idea of stuff has some problematic aspects to it. So just by putting the other option out there, hopefully it makes people think of this a little less. This is not neutral, right? It's not just a blank window. And so I hope seeing things that aren't like that puts this into sort of relief that we can think about it.
I love that. Yeah, I just love the artwork and that encapsulation of vivid imagination and things being moved around, and I love that fluidity.
Thank you so much.
And last, we have Scott Snibbe.
Hi everybody.
According to the audio from the computer.
Oh, well, we'll see how to play something. Is that okay or too loud? Should I back this off?
It's good.
We good? Okay. Well, it's nice to be here. And really nice to be with Camille and Brian again. We've been doing many, many shows. It's kind of funny because we end up in so many different parts of the world, in, you know, South Korea and Japan, and it's like the same people, the same show, but, you know, very different food and friends. Now here in San Jose. Something that's always fascinated me is the psychological construction of reality. And I think some of you have thought of this, and some of you may be hearing it for the first time, but there's no color in nature, there's no form, there's no sound, there's no taste, there's no touch, there's no smell. All of those are psychological phenomena. There's no red in nature. The red we see on the walls doesn't exist, right? Electromagnetic radiation is invisible. And that's something that's always really fascinated me, is the psychological construction of reality. And it made me realize from an early age that, you know, everything is interactive. You know, in fact, it's mostly on your side that the experience is happening. It's quite unique what, right now I'm not seeing any of you, I'm seeing a mental model in my mind of each of you. And so, then we also have, I don't know if anyone recognizes that image. Does anyone recognize where that's from? It's from 2001. You know, and that's just a reminder that we actually have 6 senses. The last sense is our mind, our imagination, thought. And that's what art is. You know, that's a creativity and imagination. And so that's a lot of what's fascinated me as an artist, is just that realizing that what's happening inside of our mind is so much from our own side, and a synthesis of things that aren't really out there in reality, which means, especially through computers, it just means your palette is so infinite. There's such an infinite array of realities beyond the one that we think there is through our senses that we evolved, which is really an illusion. So this was my first piece. I actually, you know, one of my professors, I studied computer graphics at Brown University. One of my professors, I used to make I kind of hated studying computer science, but I did it because I really wanted to use software as my medium. And I would have classes like algorithms, operating systems, whatever. But to keep myself kind of sane, I would always make a visual test program. So I'd make something like almost like a moving Kandinsky painting or a Paul Klee painting that was the output of my assignment. And sometimes my professor, Andy Van Dam, who I'm really close with, but he's quite literal-minded, and he would come by and he'd say, what is that? And I'd explain, and he'd say, that's useless. And then I started to actually call my work useless programs. I would say, yeah, what do you make? It's kind of like a defensive move, you know, how like queer people kind of reclaim the word queer and things like that. So I was like, okay, I make useless programs. I said, they're as useless as a poem or a story, a novel, a song. Right? That's how useless these programs are. So this was the first useless program that I exhibited in 1995 and 96. That's like, you know, $70,000 worth of equipment back then. And it was a program called Motion Phone.
Die Installation Motion Phone.
You get to see me really young there, 27. Oh, he was so handsome. And what I was trying to do was, I was very inspired by abstract animation in the abstraction. There was a man named Oscar Fischinger who was one of the pioneers, and others like Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. So what I did with this piece was I made a kind of telephone that you could make abstract animations. So you could have an abstract conversation with another person, in fact, any number of people. And what it did was it just took your movements of your hand through the mouse and it put them into a looped animation of abstract forms and shapes. And you end up making things that are very personal. Everyone's work looked different. And it was interesting because people that kind of had a good relationship made harmonious work together, and people who didn't. You can't insult yourself. You can't insult anybody, luckily with abstract animation. So it was kind of gentle. But this is one of the first things I did very early, before like the World Wide Web and things like that. It was a way of communicating with abstract movement. And having done that, well, let's just leave that for a second. Having done that, I really, I was always trying to get away from, computers make us more like them. They tend to kind of control us, our attention, how we move, how we act. So I was always thinking, how can you make computers more human, like make us in control of them? And what I decided was that I really wanted the body to be the interface, that the way humans interact is through our physicality, and sound and so on. So I really wanted to make pieces that interacted with your body. So this was the first one, which is called Boundary Functions. And it's right now looking at this, you can't even believe this technology existed back then, probably. But it was kind of like just the moment it was possible. But what I did was I made this piece. Camille was talking about social interactivity, and I'm always really, really interested in social interactivity. This piece is very radically social because you need more than one person for it to function at all. So when one person goes on the floor, which I think you'll see in a moment, nothing happens. Which is kind of funny. Some people have gone to my piece and they said, I went to see your piece. I was alone, and they're like, it was really subtle. So you need at least one other person. So if there's one other person, then there's a line right between you. And so that line is actually your personal space. So it's a space closer to you than to anybody else. And then as more people come on, that pattern gets more elaborate. Pattern is called a Voronoi diagram, and it describes many things in nature. The pattern that bubbles form, that stars exert a gravitational attraction, that dogs pee in, that humans settle communities. And what I wanted to show you, I've been a long-time Buddhist. I was not a Buddhist when I made this piece, but still it's somehow about a very core Buddhist idea, which is, they call emptiness, but really is interdependence. And so what I wanted to show with this piece is that you call this thing your personal space, but you don't have any when no one else is around. Like when you're alone, you don't have, you can't define your personal space. It only exists in relationship to others, and it changes without your control. And so much of everything in life is like that. In fact, it's the root of all our problems, is believing that I'm in control, I did this thing, I made it, I pulled myself up from my bootstraps and made myself successful all by myself. Nothing could be further from the truth, right? Everything is totally interdependent. No one has spoken a word tonight that we made up. So I've done a lot of pieces like this, trying to see how light, can really enliven a space and convey some strong kind of conceptual idea while being really fun. So this is a piece called Deep Walls, and you can see references, of course, to like Andy Warhol and kind of minimalism, minimalist light art of the 70s. What I was trying to do was make a wall that had a memory, so that whatever happened in front of the wall get captured and then recorded in one of those squares. And again, I wanted people to be in control of this. In a typical kind of computer interface, you'd have a countdown, 3, 2, 1, and then record. The computer's controlling you. So what I wanted to do was find a more natural way to record people. And so what I did is, as soon as the first person enters, it starts recording. As soon as the last person leaves, it stops. So you just have very natural entrances and exits, very kind of theatrically based. And it really tended to change people's behavior. People tended to perform. And one of the reasons is that I'm using the silhouette. I'm not using a color video recording. And there's something really powerful about the silhouette because you can recognize yourself and other people you know, your friends, your family, instantly. You know each other by your silhouette, the way you move. Yet to other people, you're anonymous. So it's quite a polite piece. I mean, now we're very, very aware of surveillance. This was, 24 years ago. But I was trying to get at that idea of how to be polite with surveillance in public spaces, that somehow the silhouette allows you to remain anonymous, and yet share with everybody. I did a lot of pieces with white rectangles like this. These are all pieces from the Screen series where I wanted to really play with just the white rectangle. I studied experimental film animation, so a lot of my inspiration comes from experimental film. And so you can see, like on the upper left, I think that's just a basic recording, like pure, just single recording. In the middle, the screen like eats away. Wherever you go, you kind of eat away from the screen. On the right, the screen concentrates its light on you. On the lower left, it's like a pin screen, like you push in one side and it pushes out the other. And the one on the bottom middle, it's like a piece of tofu or something, like a soft screen, a soft light, kind of a play on words. And then on the lower right, that one, it's like a cartoon character, it's shy. So if you touch it, it kind of runs away and uses like the language of animation, So I did lots and lots of pieces like this. This is one that's a little more poetic. This is based on a movie called Un Chien Andalou that maybe, has anyone seen that? It's by Dali and Buñuel. I really love surrealists because in a lot of ways, surrealism is more true to our inner reality than realism, to our psychological reality. This is based on some of my memories of a little scene from that film. There's a guy pulling a piano, kind of a metaphor somehow we all understand, even though we've probably never seen it before. And if you touch this guy long enough, he turns into ants. So it's kind of recombining some motifs from this film in an interactive context. It's kind of like an interactive poem. These, I did a number of pieces that are like electromechanical sculptures. Brett Bowman, my really good friend, and worked on this with me for about a year. And this is a piece that does similar things to what some of my other pieces do, but with fans. So it's very rare that you would say breath without saying my breath. You say this, and yet there's few things that are more in exchange with others than our breath. It's a little scary in the age of COVID, but everybody in this room, we have literally become each other already. You have breathed in my molecules, my air, my whatever, spittle, etc. And vice versa. I've breathed in every single one of you. We have literally each all become each other over the course of this conversation. And so I wanted to get at that idea where you breathe, you hold down this bar and you can make a breath recording. It's kind of almost like a seminal loop, but it's a breath loop, and then it amplifies it publicly to emphasize that how breath is constructed in public and in exchange with others. It's called Blow Up. And then this is a piece I wanted to show. I recently resurrected this piece. This is a piece called It's Out. So this is a koan. I've been a Buddhist. I'm also a Buddhist teacher and a writer. I just published a book recently called How to Train a Happy Mind. And this was kind of the early days I got into Buddhism. And there's this wonderful koan I read about. And it was before Zen Buddhism. There was Chan Buddhism, when it came from China. And there's this koan that they said, this man poses this unanswerable question. He says, if you take a duck, a baby duck, and put it in a glass bottle and let it grow up, then how can you then get the duck out of the bottle without harming the duck or breaking the bottle? And so he asked this question of a Chan master, the koan question. And the master said, okay, give me a minute. And he went walking around thinking about the question. And then he came running back and he said, it's out. So that's the koan. So my wife was quite annoyed with me telling her this story actually yesterday when we were driving. Hold on, let me get this going again. It's kind of amazing that this stuff still works actually. So Let me get this going again. Oh. Let me try this again. Okay, go live. I really like to show it really interactive, right? Okay, let's try this again. Well, I actually do have a video there. I'll show you if it doesn't. Anyway, I wanted to take the risk of actually writing it. Oh, there we go, great. So this is the piece. So there's the duck, and how do you get this duck out of the bottle? So you start touching it, and you realize, oh, it's not a duck and it's not a bottle. It's actually neither thing. And that's how everything is actually. Like, we're not, you know, are we a person? Or are we a community? Is there red? So yeah, there's no duck and there's no bottle. And it's out. It was always out. It was never out. What's inside and what's outside? You know, that's the thing. What does it mean to be inside something or outside something? Okay, think about that for a moment. These were a bunch of pieces I started in the late 90s, called the Dynamic Systems series, where I was trying to use the laws of nature as a kind of infinite canvas, like to paint with gravity or ants or bubbles and so on. Something that we really couldn't quite pin down as painting, drawing, simulation, game. And oh, you know, for this one too, I've recently been making this work again, so let me show you Gravelex. This is Gravelex. There we go. So this one was kind of drawing with gravity. And so what I wanted to do was make something that's like, that very few people see a connection between nature and computers. We usually see those as pure opposites. But I really always felt like there was a connection to them because, you know, nature is in many ways about the laws of nature. I once heard Laurie Anderson did this thing called the God, Mr. and Mrs. God, where she and this guy Ken Nordine, who's a wonderful kind of radio poet, played Mr. and Mrs. God, and then, okay, check this out, this is gonna be really cool. They played, whoa! So, people could ask Mr. and Mrs. God questions. And so, one of the people asked God, and the question said, what are your hobbies? You know, do you have any hobbies, God? And he said, well, I'm really kind of a math nut. And I think that's really true. Like, if God does it, like, what is nature made out of? It's all made out of mathematics and algorithms, and God's hobby is math. And so so with these pieces, I was trying to get many of them failed because I wanted to make pieces that were kind of like musical instruments or like going to visit a river or the beach, where it was different every time, and it rewarded more interaction. It rewarded time spent with it the way like a musical instrument does. So you can kind of learn how to play this piece in a kind of unique, unlimited way. This one I recently got working again, called Antigraph, or actually I call it murmurgraph, because myrmecologists are people that study ants. So you can drawing with ants, which I don't know if anyone had that. We recently had during this Friday. It's really hot or really cold. The ants come into your house, and I'm a Buddhist, so I can't kill them. So it's really, really hard. I end up like burning incense inside the dishwasher to get them out. It drives my wife crazy. It takes a really long time, and then there's a few stragglers, and I have to carry them out on my fingertips. So anyway, this is kind of like a pain, P-A-E-N, you know, an homage to those ants. You can't kill ants in this piece. All you can do is draw with them. And just like real ants, they're always getting lost. You see, they don't. Just like my name there, right? I never felt like a Scot, actually. In fact, my dad's here. My parents didn't even name me. They were so young and scared parents. They didn't even want to give me a name. So my uncle named me Scott after a baseball player. He was 13 years old. And I never felt like a Scot, which is great, actually, if you're a Buddhist, because you really don't want to feel like anything. You just, what are you? I'm not a Scot. And the ants don't think so either. There was one more. Let's see, let's go to this. Bubble Heart. I don't have that one working on this computer right now, But, oh, and they turned into apps. You wouldn't believe this, but they turned into #1 selling apps in the App Store when the iPad came out, which is amazing. This was Bubble Heart, which is a piece that turned that diagram you saw into musical composition in a colored line, and that's the iPad version.
And plays a note.
Anyway, I'm going to keep going. That led to this. I love. I mean, who knows who this is? Not. I mean, you know who I am. Björk. I love this because she's looking at me like I'm the crazy one. And she made, at the time, she had made 6 albums, all kind of about herself, not in like an egotistic way, but you know, the way an artist will use themselves as an avatar, like different personalities, different phases that an awful lot of people can relate to. She sold like 14 million albums or something. For her 7th album, she wanted to do something completely different and not about herself, so she chose everything else in the universe. And from the structure of DNA to the dark matter underlying our galaxy. And she invited me to collaborate with her, and some other people too, on something called Biophilia, where every single song in this album was about nature and technology, which was really cool, because she kind of felt the same way, that there was a connection between those two ththings, and music. And so every single song, we made an app that has, there's kind of an app that is an interactive experience for every single song. And the interface into it is this constellation. So every song had these musical visualizations by Stephen Malinowski. I bet Tim probably knows who that is. He's a wonderful guy who has a lot of great YouTube videos. This was a kind of sequencer that relates the phases of the moon to the phases in a woman's body, and allows you to sequence that as a song. This one was a lightning sequencer, so you can use lightning to make arpeggios. And there was a way you could either play the song with each of these experiences or use them as an instrument. This one was like a game where you could kind of resequence this song called Crystalline and, gain points and so on as you go through it. This one called Dark Matter is really far out about scales and the dark matter underlying our universe. This one was about DNA replication. DNA replicating drum machine. And virus, this is like a kind of, not a femme fatale, but a virus fatale story about viruses that love a cell so much they need to kill it. So you have these viruses, you see the little nuclei singing, turning into limbs. And it's quite scientifically accurate. They actually use these apps in science curriculum. So you have the viruses coming in, injecting their RNA to hijack the cell. And this is a little sequencer you can sequence with Björk's voice. Anyway, there's a lot to that piece. I wanted to show you one other of these pieces that I was really happy with, where we worked with Philip Glass and Beck. It's really not fun to collaborate with artists who are greater than you. And this was a whole album that was remixes of Philip Glass's music by all these great DJs. So this is Alan Tobin, My Great Ghost, Shonda Rhapsody. That's a nice one. No Such Thing. Dan Deacon. lightly interactive. You could touch them and they respond, but they also can just play by themselves. Beck did this 20-minute song. And then we made one really very highly interactive piece. What were we doing? Oh yeah, here we go. Called The Glass Machine. So this is where we took Philip Glass's, the algorithms Philip Glass uses to make music, and we made a kind of like your own remixer, so you could make your own music just like his. There we go. Okay, so I have just enough time. This is the first time I'm ever showing any of this new work in public. Just to talk a little bit about what I'm working on today. You know, I spend a lot of my time on Buddhism now. I'm a Buddhist teacher. I have a podcast called How to Train a Happy Mind, and just published a book by the same name. But I like to say I used to be a part-time Buddhist, now I'm a full-time Buddhist. But I still have an art practice, and you could see the Buddhist ideas infusing a lot of those other pieces, but now I'm working on much more explicit Buddhist imagery and work. So these type of paintings, some people, raise your hand if you've seen this type of painting, they're called tankas, and it's about a 1,300-year-old tradition, and it's been maintained across many different cultures. This is kind of Tibetan, Nepali, Himalayan style. And I studied this type of painting 22 years ago with Sharon Sherpa, who became quite a famous contemporary artist. And what struck me immediately is that what you do when you make these paintings is you first draw a grid. You draw a geometric grid underlying it, and that's what's maintained the consistency of this art over, you know, more than a millennium. So I always wanted to do something with the geometry, just the geometry that underlies these images. And so about 2 years ago, I started doing that in earnest. And so I took apart, there's a different grid for every single, if you want to call them deities. So this is Shakyamuni Buddha, who's the historic Buddha, like the Buddha who lived 2,500 years ago. And so what I did is started decimating that grid and then figuring out how to turn it into, you know, just pure rectangular geometry on the right. This one's White Tara. He's also like a very, very well-known popular deity in Tibetan Buddhism. So same thing, trying to turn that into a coherent geometric composition, kind of consistent with like Western, you know, 20th century abstraction. And then, but pretty soon I wanted to get back to reality, like get back to physical media. So these were kind of the first instances of the work where I use ink on clay, actually clay tablet, you know, what a great medium, like they put the 10 Commandments on. Or no, the ancient cuneiform writing. It's like the first form of writing. So this is the Shakyamuni Buddha grid, just ink on clay. And then, so I worked developing an algorithm to interpret each of those geometric pieces to a particular color. And so where I'm getting those colors is I'm actually taking a traditional tanka, turning to a very low resolution image, and then sampling it. So this is the first one I did by hand, like this is in Blender, you know, where I went and I mapped each of the polygons into the texture space, and you end up with this like very, very soft imagery, which what I was trying to get at is that just like in nature, you know, the geometric or mathematical reality is some way the more real underlying aspect of reality. And so I wanted to get at that with this imagery. But also when you meditate on these images, they tell you to meditate and see the deity very, very clearly, see its arms and fingernails and so on. But generally what you see is something quite vague. So I wanted to get at what your meditative experience was more like. And also as you do these visualizations, they kind of come out of a kind of glowing, you know, emptiness, and they dissolve back into it. So I wanted to get more into the experience you actually have as a meditator. And so there's a number of pieces, you know, I'm doing a lot of different pieces in the series, with kind of different ways of interpreting that grid. This is White Tara. And there are time-based pieces too, so I have pieces where it kind of works through that color space in the pieces. And what these pieces do when you sit with them is they actually induce a meditative experience. So it's quite difficult for most people to meditate. But with certain aids, people can meditate very easily, and especially something like this. You sit in front of this for a couple minutes and you are there. You're really in a state where you're not thinking the past, not anticipating the future, not thinking about yourself. And okay, and then this, I decided I really wanted to go back to the traditional materials. These paintings are made with a very, very ancient materials, ground up minerals and animal glue. It's like the same materials they used to paint on the walls of Egyptian tombs. And I really wanted to go back to the authentic materials, so it would take too long to tell the whole story, but through an improbable series of karmic events, I got invited to Nepal to go learn how to paint the authentic way, and I found a way to find the materials in Tokyo, where they're still ground and sold to anyone who wants to buy them. And so I just came back actually last week. I spent 2 weeks studying this very difficult medium. They taught me all the tricks. So this is my first completed painting, where I've translated that algorithm back into physical painting. It relates a lot to Paul Klee. I've always been a big fan of Paul Klee and that way of treating color like music, very musical use of color. But what's important about this is like, there's a reason, someone always said, I often said to people like, why is it an oil paint? Why is it green? I always want to have a reason for everything in my art. And when I teach art, it's the same thing. I ask people, why is it metal? Why is it glass? Why is it plastic? And so every single shape here, there's a reason why it's that color. It wasn't my choice, but it's a kind of algorithm through which there is some choice, of that infinite expression of the algorithm. But there's an underlying mathematical logic to it. Oh yeah, so that's it. That's me in my studio and my website. Thank you very much. It's fun to show that work for the first time.
Questions?
I realize your older pieces, like you talked about when you were making pieces that had to play as musical instruments, that you would have a lot of failings and mistakes in them. Can you share like some of the things you've learned, mistakes you've made in there?
Oh yeah, well it's just about like flatness, it's that idea of infinite expressibility, that if something, a lot of what my drivers is wonder, awe, I've definitely, you don't see, like, my work's not about, like, bombing in Gaza and things like that, although I think about those things a lot, but how to bring joy, wonder, awe to people. We all need, like, beautiful connecting experiences in life. And a lot of the greatest way of connecting is actually connecting with yourself, that there's an underlying beauty inside of our minds all the time. Especially from a Buddhist perspective, they call it your Buddha nature, but it's actually fundamental goodness. And so that's kind of, in many ways, it's kind of a funny way to answer your question, but it was looking for those experiences where the more you used it, the more it rewarded use of it. So much, almost everything we use in the computer, video games are a good example, like, they get worn out, social media, it's just like use. I try to avoid all the like negative keywords like consumerism, but it's like that, right? It's a lot of the way we experience reality is consumptive. And so to find something that is the opposite of consumptive, which is creative, And so when I was younger especially, I think a lot of artists have the idea like, oh, if only everyone could be an artist. So part of it when I was young was that more naive view, oh, if everyone is an artist, they'd be so happy. But I think a slightly more mature view is that that's actually a way for a person to see their own mind reflected in something. That there's some uniqueness, some infinite expressiveness, and ease actually, like an ease, instantly easy to use, and yet the more you use it, the better you get, like a musical instrument. Those are some of the principles. Other question, yeah.
So it's been great to kind of see the recap of your journey, through everything you've created. I'm kind of curious, I have a couple of questions to ask. One is, have you found that the tools that you were using have changed over time to kind of align with what's available, right? Like, has your relationship with code changed? And you talked about going back to kind of like the tangible medium.
Mm-hmm.
And kind kind of curious in your journey where you find yourself looking at and seeing.
Yeah, so in terms of like actually working with code, you know, it's just, you reach a point, it's like that Malcolm Gladwell recently wrote a book about how wrong he was in so many of his books. But I think one of the things he was right about is that 10,000 hours thing, that you need 10,000 hours to master something. So I mastered computer programming like when I was 19, because I started when I was 10. And so I think for those of us who have done that, it's more like talking, you know, you don't forget it. It's kind of amazing. And it's the same language, you know, I wrote C++, you know, since I was since the 80s. And it's kind of a cool language to keep with, because it still works and it's really fast. And so it's the same code, like you can keep getting it working over and over again everywhere. So the process of coding, it's bizarrely the same. It's like very, very comfortable, you know, like having a conversation with an old friend or something like that. But the thing that's changed is like the technology caught up, and the marketplace also caught up, because there was really nobody was buying this work when I was younger, and you couldn't make big displays and things like that. So a lot of it, that is just the maturity where you can just, you know, I'm on WhatsApp with Chinese display manufacturer, like, okay, can I have a square display? Can I have a 4:3 display? Can it be 22 inches? Can it be touchscreen? They're like, yes, it's $762, $200 for the PC. Like, that's just wonderful that it's all now really available and mature and accessible, and looks great, you know, looks great in a gallery. So I think it's nice to be, I'm in my 50s, I'm 55 now. So it's kind of nice to see that digital art now just being art, and having instantiate. So it's more on the hardware side and the supply chain. Also, nobody took you seriously, but I would have to kind of pretend I was someone else when I was calling or emailing people, but now people really respect digital art. There's no, it's like, I'm an artist, I need some displays, like, oh great, you know, we'll give you all the information you need. I think the biggest one though is there was a real joy and naivety and kind of love of technology until about 10, 15 years ago. And then with the rise of like Facebook and social media, you know, social media in general, and tracking and Netflix and everything, like, boy, do we not feel good about technology now. Like when we were, up until like 15 years ago, like everybody thought we were so cool, and you know, it started so early, you know, for me in the 80s and the 90s and early 2000s. So there's no real illusions now that like, ooh, technology, fun, cool, new thing. I think there's a lot of wariness about technology, which is very reasonable to have. So when you see a talk like this, now it's almost the opposite. People are like, oh, there's a nice thing you can do with technology. You know, there's something non-intrusive, non-invasive, non-destructive. So it's kind of gone the opposite direction, where everybody was so excited about technology, and the people in it were all in it for really constructive reasons up to about, you know, 15 years ago. And now technology is seen as so destructive, and we're kind of like artifacts of a kind of a naive, sweet, beautiful approach to technology. But anyone can still take that approach. You know, it hasn't changed. Like, it still has this beautiful potential. I always thought of the computer screen like a movie screen. It can be anything, right? It just, that glowing light can turn into anything. So I think to be reminded of that is sort of nice when you hear a talk like this, that this is very beautiful, constructive things you can do with technology. Yeah.
So why did you start working? You love the moving screen and the possibility of it, the non-attachment of it, but then you started working in solid materials again. And why did you do that? Would you consider that like more attachments, or what does that represent to you to actually work on?
Well,
physical material that isn't changing.
Yeah, I mean, everything's changed. Everything's changing,
but not the speed and the.
It was just a logical, kind of the way I explained it in shorthand, but I don't really believe in like agency. It's more like just listening to your life, and I think this is good advice for everybody. Like, the more you think there's a solid, separate me making decisions, the more deluded you are. It's more just like listening like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do right now. You know, it wasn't much like, I want to do this thing. It was like, oh, this is why I took that class 22 years ago with that guy. And, you know, suddenly it just kind of said, like, I think the less you think about yourself, the less you even believe there is a self to think about, the more life is like, you know, like surfing. Like, what is a surfer controlling exactly when they're surfing a wave? Like, what's going on there? To be a California example, you know, I think everything's like that. And so it's just like, that's what the environment was telling me to do. But it made sense. I think you understood from the explanation why that made sense. I'm particularly interested in taking, you know, making more explicitly Buddhist work, and bringing, things need to be reinvented, you know, each century. And so to bring Buddhist imagery into the high contemporary art, you know, to have a place in the museum, to be one of the people doing that, have a place in the museum, and then awaken people to all that history behind it, like to make something old new again, but while being really respectful of the tradition. Like, it was really neat, the connection I made with the people in that studio in Nepal, because they really loved the paintings, and they're like, oh, we've been doing this for 1,300 years and nobody ever colored in the diagram, you know. So it's neat to feel a connection to history, and also to make something new, right? In some ways, that's the definition of art practice, is you slightly expand the bubble of culture. You do something a tiny bit new, you add something a little bit. A lot of people are confused about what art is. So many, right, I think Camille teaches art, right? So many people are confused about art. They think art is making something, which is not, at least not being a professional artist. Art is slightly expanding the bubble of our understanding of reality, you know, helping us to understand cultural reality, humanity, the universe, like just however slightly expanding that envelope. Sorry, long answer to a seemingly simple question. Should we all get up together to talk a little bit, or what was Tim's intention?
Yeah, we can expand the questions, direct them to both Camille and Scott. I think Brian.
Is Brian asleep?
I think he went to sleep. Yeah.
Okay. Good night, Brian.
It's late in New York.
Should we turn on the lights a little?
Yeah.
Bedtime in Massachusetts. I mean, we can keep going. I'm going to take this off. Here, Camille, you want to come up here?
Yeah, I think people can probably hear it, but.
Oh yeah, do we not need this? Yeah, we don't need it.
Just talk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Every question.
Somebody gets to meet me.
Oh yeah.
I've heard, seen little glimpses, but just to see more of it is nice.
Yeah, that's the first time I showed it to him.
I like the phrase, the opposite of consumerism or consumptive.
It's creative. It's creative.
I think there's like an essence of the artists that spoke tonight is definitely the organic undertones, right? Whether it's like you're replicating or kind of connecting with natural patterns and like you say the geometry, those other types of things. And I love the way that each of you have taken your lens to look at those organic elements and create these beautiful things that are either connecting back to like historical Buddhist, you know, geometry, or taking like fine art and then kind of adding an interactive element. So it's less of a question, but just more of an observation of, you know, the folks that Tim has chosen to speak tonight. And then you have your own organic undertones as well. So yeah, really cool.
Also not a question, but I did want to say that I was there for the fallen poetry thing.
And patent pending, or?
I remember that one,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Thanks for remembering, yeah. Someone wrote on this listserv that we're on that they also remembered the RX show. I didn't know who it was though, so it's interesting, yeah. Who remembers what? It's good.
I was wondering, how much does traditional art inform, I guess, your digital interests into, or digital, I guess, explorations? If there a pull towards traditional somewhere?
I mean, I still love going to museums to look at painting. You know, I think, I'm not sure what it got to this and what I was talking about tonight, but like there's something about standing in front of a painting, especially if it's 1,300 years old, but even if it's 100 years old, or even if it's 20 years old, and you're like standing in the place where somebody was standing, you know, making that, and they're not there now, and you're there, and it kind of still always gives me the chills, like that you can stand in front of something and like feel, I don't know, I feel that person, right? Even if I don't know them, like you sense that they took so much time usually or care to make something. So for me, that my favorite work is where I hope there's like some sense of connectedness to something that's, you know, human, but then maybe in these bigger systems it is like a sense of nature, or like these cycles of things that I was thinking about in like all of our work, this sense of like the cyclical, maybe a little bit less in my work, but like the deep walls or Brian's frogs, but right, like, and then these deeper cycles of history too. I've done a lot of pieces too that I didn't show, like with a lot of archival images and things in it, like old maps, or you started to see tiny bit of that in the last piece, not very well, but like how can we use digital technology also to make new connections back to these other cycles of time? I think I like that, I guess, if I'm answering your question. I really love to, I think artists do that, right? Like I talk about this with students too, the difference between just like making something and being like what I would think of as more like a professional artist is we have a field just like scientists or historians or anyone, right? Like you wouldn't go start doing biology experiments and not like look at what people have done, and if you're in that field you cite the work in a very specific way. Artists don't have that kind of structure of like we have to put the citations in a certain way, but we're always quoting past work, right? Or always like riffing on these old things. I think people that really are invested in it at the 10,000 hour level, right? Is like how are you part of these like longer traditions? Because you look at those older works and you can imagine what someone was thinking, even if they're like so different from you.
Yeah, because for me it's 100%, you know, inspiration from the past. My parents are artists, and so we grew up with art as our religion, really, and you know, I didn't even know what realistic art was until I was like 10 years old or something, because it was all abstraction, it was all like Paul Klee, Kandinsky. So that was all like what filled my mind. And then when I went to college and studied, you know, I studied experimental animation and computer science. And so then I got introduced to these abstract filmmakers from the 20s. I think a lot of artists, like there's like one or two things that just become a very large part of your brain, you know. And so for me it was because I was crying, like the first time I saw Oscar Fischinger, just black and white animation, and I was like pouring tears, like, how does this abstract triangles moving make me cry, right? It was so moving. And I also felt like, I want to do that, you know, I want to do the same kind of thing. And, but in my own way, like, because I like computers, I grew up programming when I was 10 years old, started. So I think it's, like my art has nothing to do with technology, like zero. But I use technology as it's like saying your paint, like there are a few painters whose paintings are about paint, but most aren't. Most aren't, right?
I might argue about that.
Well, that none of them are about paint?
I think they're all about paint.
Oh, they're all, well, yeah. Well, I mean, they're all certainly all made of paint. They're certainly all made of paint. But yeah, it's not, that's my own perspective. It's 100% inspiration from, you know, history, but especially also inspiration from the world of like philosophy and you know, contemporary art, minimalist art, light art, things like that. I do think to be a professional artist, like Camille said, is to be aware of what came before and to try to make, you know, some incremental contribution.
Go ahead. Speaking of medium, both of you guys, as far as I could tell, the output is always a projector or a video screen. Do you guys ever play with other outputs?
Well, you saw my pieces with the word air, like using breath, you know, just air.
Oh, I love that. Right. I love that.
So yeah, sometimes, and I did some work with tactile, also like haptic, like just pure touch feedback and things like. So sometimes.
And now he's doing paint on canvas.
I've done some, I did what I would call reactive sculpture, like it was using sensors. Oh, actually those had screens in them too.
That's the input though.
There were things that you were holding, like small, this is before like iPhones and watches. You know, I was thinking about like what is a different relationship we could have with those screens with our body, that they reacted the way you held them or moved them. And then, I said to someone, I'm starting to make some prints now too that don't plug in at all, you know, but that they're using different kind of algorithmic processes like in their making. So I think
And Brian's work, you know, those the 3D prints of the three-dimensional reaction diffusion. Those are amazing. Like that's really
I've never
great.
seen those in person.
Yeah, I saw one. I was just visiting.
I think I have to say something.
Okay.
I'm Scott's father, and like you said, we've always been art is our life, and I don't know. I saw tonight things that I had no idea that he did. You know, like he doesn't even tell me this half the stuff he does. It's so amazing. And then like I came to this lecture because I wanted to find out what the hell he's been doing all day. And like literally, you know, it's amazing. So anyway, I just want to honor my son and how amazing he is, and how I love the first of all, I love any artist because they always come up with something that I would never think about or create. My art is my own expression of myself and my own thoughts, and it was just fun to see all the different philosophical things behind your art and the Buddhist influence, and you've always combined art with computers, you know, which is amazing. I know nothing. I made him a bet that I would never buy a computer, and I lost. And so to me it's so fascinating, the mental process behind this complicated machine, right, that he makes to use art, which is so great. He uses to make art, and anyway, it was inspiring to me tonight, and also the whole Buddhist thing. You know, I've always also completely connected with Eastern religions for many years, and obviously been an influence in that direction somewhere. And anyway, I just feel like so inspired by you and your amazing processes, and every artist. Like we all have some strange thing that we decide we want to do. You know, like it's so amazing. Like I actually created light sculpture in 1987. You know, there was nobody doing light sculpture. So like we just do stuff because Spirit tells us to do it. You know, and like we don't make a decision that we're going to create something. The creation is like a process that we have to do. And I love that. I'm just inspired and happy that I created myself and you and I'll just honor artists in general because we're so creative and interesting, and it's amazing what we decide to be art. What is art? You know, like it is part of our own expression in the universe. It's a beautiful thing.
Always nice to have your dad in the audience.
Say something like in relation to just like people who nurture things too, because we were talking like about this RX show and the curator who did that, this guy Will Lim. I like went on a Google quest last night to find him and see where he was. He's in Zagreb, Croatia, but you know, he was a producer of all different kinds of things in the Bay Area for a really long time. But that space was much like this space, I mean, even smaller, scrappier kind of space, right? That he and now spacing, there was his like sort of co-producer there, you know, these people that put like their heart and soul into spaces to support artists to do things like this, and they may be part of the community too, but, and then some of these curators we're talking about who, you know, really went out on a limb to kind of be like fundraising to get the projectors and deal with the technology and find the space when it really wasn't, and Scott alluded to it, but it really wasn't seen as serious. I mean, maybe even worse. I don't know, I'm not sure. We were just like not, it was very unclear to people like what this was, or it certainly couldn't be art. So I just wanted to give a props like to spaces like this, and then like people that volunteer their time and energy, because no arts community can like survive without that kind of dedication.
And how about DORPA?
Dark box.
Yeah, that was huge
so
for
many,
me.
so
Yeah,
many.
just so inspiring.
Yeah,
Yeah.
another great example. I mean, there's so many examples, and that history sometimes doesn't get as much attention as it should because those spaces like come and go, or those groups, dark bots still going, but like groups, come and go based on the people that are willing to put the time and energy into them. So.
Yeah. And now this gray area.
Yeah, and actually, so this is part of a month-long series for, it's pronounced CODAME, it's CODAME, CODAME. But this, I was excited to discover this space down in San Jose as a part of the series. But next Thursday, we have another event at Gray Area, which is one of those interactive spaces. Where we're gonna meet some of the artists that have work showing there. But this was just so very inspiring and kind of a piece of this larger story this month that CODAME is hosting. So yeah, it's exciting.
So some of this artwork can be challenging to archive. I mean, to be inspired by past work, you have to be able to view it.
That's a really good point.
Some of this stuff is hard to view and experience unless it's archivable in some way.
On the good news front on that, I just gave a talk to a class in Bern. I think it's the Academy of Art in Bern. Like Europe is way ahead of us on that, but there's people getting master's degrees in like specifically archiving this kind of media. It's really hard, but I think finally there's people that are like interested in starting to think about that. And I've had to conserve things, so I was trying to redo things. It's not impossible, but it will take a field coalescing around that to think about best practices and how to do it.
Code ends up being, it's so funny because people think it's so much, it will live forever, it's just bits, but it's actually the most fragile, because it's that interdependence. It's not actually, the code's actually quite short, it's just a text, but this is like the interdependence I was talking about before. A computer program is not a text file. Those are just a string of characters that has to be interpreted and then run in this giant interconnected web of things in certain versions of certain software and drivers, and it's just there's
operating
no way.
system.
One of my friends described it as technological art as like skipping stones in a river. Like you have to get to the next stone. Like they're about 10 years apart.
Yeah.
But if you miss a stone, you kind of fall in and it's gone.
Or you just have a computer that you don't update that has certain frameworks and
Yeah, but then
systems.
but the cosmic rays decay the memory chips. Like it doesn't. It's so fragile. But because I was kind of a Buddhist for so long, people always ask me that question. I said, the average age of a civilization is 330 years, right? We've got much bigger issues with preservation, like our entire civilization, not even just our nation. So if people want these things to live on, they'll find a way to live on. Like there was recently a Harold Cohen show that Christiane Paul put on at the Whitney, who's one of the very earliest computer artists, and everything had to be completely reinvented, taking the code and make it work in new platforms and emulators and new robots. But if people want it to happen, it happens. Like it just has to be valuable enough to culture, or you have to put in the time yourself to keep porting it into the future.
I also want to acknowledge Tim, because Tim and I collaborated on the space palette. And we met in a museum show in Santa Cruz, where I was showing my light sculpture and he was showing his machine, which is amazing. So I just want to acknowledge you for putting this together.
Yeah.
I flew here from Maui to be here tonight.
It's a great area all month. Is it here?
And it's at the Light Gallery next door.
Oh, nice.
The new version.
Yeah, Collide Galleries. It's only open like Thursday, Friday, Saturday.
Right.
But the one at Gray Area is open all.
So anyway, I'm honored to have collaborated. We were partners for like 3 or 4 years, about 10 years ago, and I also got to build the base of the Boundary Functions project at the Tech Museum in San Jose years ago, and helped me with some of the installation. I was very honored to be part of those things. Thank you.
Yeah, we all have a huge. With the technological art, you need a lot of collaborators and friends and people who are willing to work for free or very little.
It's a team effort.
Thank you.
Yeah.